that sink in. 2 shootings in 1 lifetime, all before graduating college. We cannot allow ourselves to become numb to this. This level of trauma is not normal, it is not inevitable, and it is not acceptable. If we are serious about protecting young people in America, Congress must act now. That means universal background checks, a ban on assault weapons designed for mass killing, cracking down on ghost guns, and investing in mental health and safe storage policies grounded in data.
You just heard that with your own ears, and you feel it in your bones because you know the speaker is stating a truth so fundamental that it cuts through all the noise and all the deflection and all the obfuscation that has poisoned our discourse around gun violence for decades. The speaker is looking directly into the moral abyss of American policy failure and refusing to turn away, declaring with absolute clarity that 330 school shootings recorded in 2024 mark the second highest number since 1966. And wait, there's more. Because we need to reckon with something genuinely apocalyptic here. There's been a 715% increase in the number of people wounded and killed in school shootings between 2004 and 2024. 715%, which means we have normalized a level of carnage that would have been incomprehensible to previous generations. The speaker forces us to confront students who have survived not 1 but 2 school shootings before they even finish their education. Imagine that for a moment, because this is the banality of evil playing out in real time. Children whose formative years include the trauma of active shooter drills and the lived experience of gunfire in hallways where they should be learning algebra and discussing literature. And what does the Republican Party do when confronted with this existential moral crisis? They block everything. They obstruct every single piece of meaningful legislation while the gun violence prevention movement passed the bipartisan Safer Communities Act in 2022, the first major gun safety law in nearly 30 years. But here's what should make your blood boil, because the numbers are staggering. 52% of Americans support a ban on assault rifles, while support has decreased from 61% in 2019, yet somehow we cannot get this done in Congress, and when you dig into the polling, the contradictions become even more damning, because 92% of Democrats and 70% of Republicans support background checks for private gun sales, with overall support at 81%, and Quinnipiac found 89% overall support, with 98% of Democrats and 84% of Republicans backing background checks for all sales, which means we live in a democracy where supermajorities of citizens across party lines support common-sense gun reform, and yet the system cannot deliver it. This is not a failure of public opinion. This is a structural failure of democratic representation that reveals the profound corruption at the heart of our political institutions. Now, before you think this is just about one horrific statistic, let me tell you exactly how much worse it gets. Because 2021, 2022, 2023, and 2024 all set records for school shootings since at least 2008, 4 consecutive years of record-breaking gun violence in schools. Think about what that means for an entire generation of young people who have come of age knowing that their classroom might become a crime scene, that their school might trend on social media for all the wrong reasons, that active shooter drills are as routine as fire drills. This is the psychological terrorism of institutional inaction, and the Republicans know exactly what they're doing because Senate Republicans blocked efforts to pass an assault weapons ban and universal background checks legislation after the United States broke the record for the most mass shootings in a single year, with Republican Senator John Barrasso objecting despite pleas from Democrats citing harrowing statistics. So when the speaker in this clip talks about universal background checks and assault weapons bans and cracking down on ghost guns, they are not proposing radical fringe ideas. They are articulating the overwhelming consensus of the American people, the evidence-based solutions that researchers and public health experts have been screaming about for years, while the gun lobby and their wholly owned subsidiaries in the Republican caucus perform their kabuki theater of thoughts and prayers. Here's where the institutional violence becomes so clear it's almost unbearable, because House Republicans openly ignore the gun violence epidemic, defunding or reducing funding for numerous research programs that improve our understanding of this crisis, as well as programs that help prevent gun violence. And get this, they allocated $0 for firearm injury and mortality prevention research, a $25 million cut, $0 for community and youth violence prevention, an $18.1 million cut, and $0 for the National Violent Death Reporting System, a $24.5 million cut. They are deliberately blinding us to the scope of the crisis, defunding the very research that could save lives because the gun industry's profits matter more than children's safety. Guns are the #1 killer of kids and young people in the United States. And Republicans are gutting critical funding at the direction of their gun industry CEO campaign donors. This is not governance. This is legalized child sacrifice to the altar of the Second Amendment, as interpreted by extremists who have hijacked the conservative movement. The speaker says this level of trauma is not normal, not inevitable, not acceptable, and they are correct on every single count, because when we examine what policy looks like in the current Congress, we see the 1119th Congress has a Republican majority in both chambers, with 219 Republicans and 215 Democrats in the House, and 53 Republicans and 47 Democrats in the Senate. And what have they done with this power? They're a gun lobby-backed majority, where too many lawmakers not only refuse to pass new life-saving gun safety laws, but work to tear down even the most basic laws already on the books, with the Trump-Vance administration expressing desire to pass bills favored by the gun lobby, roll back progress made under Biden-Harris and through the bipartisan Safer Communities Act, and defund and undermine the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. They want to dismantle the agency responsible for enforcing gun laws, while House and Senate Republicans have introduced at least 26 bills aimed at loosening federal gun laws in 2025. So while our children are being murdered in their classrooms, the Republican response is to make it easier for dangerous people to obtain weapons of war. This is sociopathy masquerading as political philosophy. Let's talk about what the evidence actually tells us, because unlike the Republican Party, which traffics in vibes and Second Amendment fundamentalism, the progressive movement is grounded in data and empirical reality. Former President Bill Clinton signed a 10-year assault weapons ban into law in 1994 that expired in 2004, and several studies, including one published in 2019, showed that mass shooting deaths were reduced during the years the ban was in effect. We had a policy that worked, we let it expire, and now we're reaping the consequences. The 1994 assault weapons ban was associated with a 25% drop in gun massacres and a 40% drop in fatalities, and as soon as the ban expired, fatalities and shootings skyrocketed again, with researchers estimating that if we still had a federal assault weapons ban, we would see 70% fewer mass shooting deaths. 70% fewer, which means every single one of those children in Uvalde, and Parkland and Sandy Hook, and countless other communities, might still be alive if we had maintained a policy that we know works. This is not theoretical, this is not debatable, this is settled science, and the Republican Party rejects it because it threatens the profit margins of gun manufacturers. The speaker mentions ghost guns, and this is another area where Republican obstruction reaches levels of deliberate malevolence, because unregulated firearms that can be assembled without serial numbers represent an end run around every single safety measure we have. Yet when Democrats try to address this Maine-passed legislation prohibiting unserialized firearms, also known as ghost guns, at the state level because the federal government controlled by Republicans refuses to act, we're left with a patchwork of state regulations that gun traffickers exploit by simply crossing state lines. The speaker is right to call out this systemic failure because Republican legislative leadership refused to hold a vote on gun safety measures supported by 7 in 10 Minnesotans, forcing Governor Walz to issue executive orders. This is what minoritarian rule looks like, a small faction of extremists backed by the gun lobby holding the entire country hostage while children die. Here's something that should radicalize every single person watching this, because the disconnect between public opinion and legislative action reveals the profound illegitimacy of our current political system. 86% of American adults support Congress mandating background checks for all firearm sales and transfers, and nearly 3/4 support Congress requiring gun owners to take a test, obtain a license, and register their firearms, similar to the process of owning an automobile. This is not a close call. This is overwhelming consensus, yet Murphy asked, how does democracy survive if 90% of Americans want something and we can't deliver it? He's asking the right question because when the will of 90% of the population can be thwarted by a minority faction captured by corporate interests, we no longer have a functioning democracy. We have an oligarchy with democratic aesthetics. The Republican Party has become the institutional mechanism through which the gun industry converts the corpses of children into quarterly earnings. The speaker talks about investing in mental health and safe storage policies grounded in data, and this too is revealing, because Republicans love to deflect from gun policy by saying it's really about mental health. Okay, fine, let's fund mental health services, except they allocated only $126 million for Project Aware, which provides mental health support for school-age children, a $13.4 million cut. They don't actually want to fund mental health either, they just want to change the subject. And regarding safe storage, research has demonstrated decreased risk for suicide among adolescents when guns are stored safely, with states that have child access prevention laws seeing suicide rates lowered by up to 14% in youth ages 1 to 17 years old. We know what works, we have the data, we have the evidence, but implementing these policies would require confronting the gun lobby's ideological opposition to any regulation whatsoever. So instead we get Republican leaders saying executive orders propose no real solutions to keeping kids safe, with Senate Republican leader Mark Johnson claiming executive action to study and educate the public on gun safety are not actual solutions. They reject both policy action and research into policy action. This is nihilism. This is the politics of permanent crisis management, where dead children are just the price of doing business. Let me tell you what's actually happening right now in Congress. Because while Democrats propose evidence-based solutions, House Republicans advanced reconciliation legislation that eliminated the $200 transfer tax on silencers that has existed since Congress passed the National Firearms Act in 1934, a tax enacted for specific weapons because of the magnitude of their dangerousness and the regularity with which they were used in crime. They want to make it easier to buy silencers, devices that obstruct law enforcement efforts to respond to active shooters, by making it difficult to recognize gunfire and locate the source of gunshots, mask muzzle flash, and reduce recoil, increasing the risk of multiple casualty shootings, and were used in the 2019 Virginia Beach shooting that killed 12 people. This is the Republican agenda, making weapons more deadly and harder to trace while defunding violence prevention programs. The Trump administration has proposed slashing nearly a quarter of the ATF's budget. They are systematically dismantling the infrastructure of gun violence prevention, while children survive multiple school shootings. The moral bankruptcy becomes even clearer when you understand the broader pattern, because Democrats in both chambers have announced a plan to outlaw about every common semi-automatic firearm with a detachable magazine through comprehensive assault weapons legislation. This is what responding to a crisis looks like. This is what governing in the public interest looks like. Yet national concealed carry reciprocity is the absolute prize for Republicans, who are better positioned than ever to codify their wish list into law. Though their razor-thin House majority of 218 to 215 and the filibuster in the Senate stand in their way, with Senate Majority Leader Thune pledging to keep the filibuster, though Trump might demand Republicans scrap it, and as it stands, even with a 3-seat majority, Republicans don't have the votes to overcome a filibuster over policies like concealed carry reciprocity. So the only thing standing between us and a complete victory for the gun lobby is the slimmest of margins and procedural rules that Republicans might eliminate at any moment. The Speaker says Congress must act now, and the urgency cannot be overstated, because while we debate and obstruct and perform political theater, real human beings are experiencing unfathomable trauma. There have been 17 school shootings this year that resulted in injuries or deaths, according to Education Week, with 238 such shootings since 2018. Think about that number, 238 school shootings in just 7 years. We're averaging more than one school shooting per month for nearly a decade, and we're supposed to accept this as normal. The Speaker refuses to accept it. Anyone with a functioning moral compass refuses to accept it. But accepting it is exactly what the Republican Party demands, because the alternative would be confronting the gun lobby that funds their campaigns and the extremist base that votes in their primaries. Here's where the class dynamics become impossible to ignore, because wealthy politicians send their children to elite private schools with extensive security, while working-class kids in public schools get active shooter drills and trauma. 72% of Americans support funding community-based gun violence prevention programs that provide outreach, conflict mediation, and social support for those at high risk of gun violence. These community violence intervention programs focus on individuals most at risk of being a victim of or committing an act of gun violence, providing a public health approach that addresses the unique needs of communities where systemic racism, disinvestments, and trauma occur. This is how you actually reduce violence, not through militarizing schools or arming teachers, but through addressing root causes and intervening with at-risk individuals. Yet, Democrats warn that Republicans' budget plan could threaten funding for gun violence research and prevention, with the GOP proposal potentially emboldening the Trump administration to shortchange anti-violence efforts. They're not just refusing to fund solutions, they're actively defunding the solutions we've already implemented. The philosophical stakes here extend far beyond gun policy, because what we're witnessing is the collision between two fundamentally incompatible worldviews. On one side, you have the progressive vision grounded in public health, collective responsibility, evidence-based policy, and the basic principle that children have a right to learn without fear of being murdered. On the other side, you have the conservative vision, which has degenerated into a kind of social Darwinist death cult that treats gun ownership as a quasi-religious sacrament and dead children as acceptable collateral damage in defense of an absolutist interpretation of the Second Amendment. that would have been alien to the founders. The speaker is articulating the progressive vision when they say this is not inevitable. They're rejecting the fatalism that conservatives use to justify inaction. They're insisting that policy choices have consequences, and different choices would produce different outcomes. Let me be absolutely clear about what's at stake, because when Republicans vote unanimously against assault weapons bans, even as high-powered assault weapons are used at a frightening rate to commit mass murder in communities across the country from Buffalo to Uvalde to Indianapolis, because these weapons are designed to kill with ruthless efficiency, they are making a choice when they object to background check legislation, claiming they're not asked to vote on polling questions, but on legislation, and argue it has real problems because it's not solely about transactions involving guns at gun stores, but about fathers passing down hunting rifles to sons or friends lending shotguns to neighbors. They are using edge cases and hypotheticals to justify obstruction while children die in the aggregate. These are not good faith arguments. These are rhetorical smokescreens deployed to protect economic interests and ideological commitments at the expense of human lives. The Speaker's call for Congress to act must be understood in the context of legislation to repeal the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act passed by Congress in 2005, which gives the gun industry a unique and unjustifiable legal liability shield that protects gun manufacturers from lawsuits. No other industry enjoys this kind of immunity. Imagine if pharmaceutical companies couldn't be sued for defective drugs or car manufacturers couldn't be sued for faulty brakes. The gun industry has successfully insulated itself from basic market accountability. Numerous cases have been dismissed on the basis of PLCAA, even when gun dealers and manufacturers acted in a fashion that would qualify as negligent if it involved any other product, and responsible manufacturers and dealers don't need this legal protection, while irresponsible ones hide behind it. This is regulatory capture at its most obscene. The industry has purchased enough politicians to literally grant itself immunity from the consequences of its own negligence. The Speaker talks about students experiencing 2 shootings before graduating college, and this biographical detail should haunt us because it represents the wholesale failure of adult society to protect children. We have normalized mass casualty events to such an extent that surviving multiple shootings is becoming a common experience for young people. This is generational trauma being inflicted in real time, and we're doing it to ourselves through policy choices. The highest number of annual school shootings over the past 6 decades came in 2021 to 2024, despite increased efforts to harden schools with cameras and weapons detection systems, as well as bolster resources to address students' emotional and mental well-being. Hardening schools doesn't work. The security theater doesn't work. What works is keeping weapons of war out of civilian hands and implementing universal background checks. But those solutions threaten industry profits, so Republicans reject them. When the Speaker declares this is not inevitable, they're making an argument that should be obvious, but has been obscured by decades of propaganda. Other developed democracies do not experience this level of gun violence. This is uniquely American pathology created by uniquely American policy choices. The international comparisons are so stark they're almost embarrassing. We're the only wealthy nation where children regularly die in school shootings, where parents have to wonder if dropping their kids off at school might be the last time they see them alive, where teachers have to learn how to barricade doors and treat gunshot wounds as part of their job description. This didn't happen by accident. It happened because we have political institutions captured by moneyed interests and an ideological movement that prioritizes abstract constitutional arguments over concrete human suffering. The Speaker's emphasis on data-driven policies is crucial, because Republicans have spent years trying to undermine gun violence research. House Republicans approved an amendment to the fiscal year 2025 Labor, Health and Human Services funding bill that would prohibit money for research on gun violence prevention and limit research to treatment of gunshot injuries, introduced by Congressman Andrew Clyde, who operates 2 gun stores. They don't want us to study gun violence because the research might support policies they oppose. This is anti-intellectual obscurantism in service of commercial interests. They would rather keep us ignorant than risk evidence contradicting their ideological priors. Meanwhile, the $25 million Congress has steered toward gun violence research every year since 2019, split between NIH and CDC, has typically not been written into budget bills, but included in explanatory text that, while traditionally followed, is not legally binding to the same degree, allowing the Trump administration to potentially spend that money elsewhere. So even the minimal research funding we've secured is under threat from an administration hostile to evidence-based governance. The tragedy here is that we know exactly what needs to be done. The Speaker lays it out with perfect clarity. Universal background checks to ensure prohibited purchasers can't obtain firearms, assault weapons bans to remove weapons of war from civilian circulation, ghost gun restrictions to prevent untraceable firearms from flooding the market, mental health investments and safe storage requirements to prevent suicides and accidental deaths. These are not radical proposals. These are common-sense measures supported by overwhelming majorities, including 50% of Republicans supporting universal background checks and 54% supporting gun licensing, with over 90% of Democrats supporting both provisions. Political will exists among voters. What's missing is the political courage among elected Republicans to defy the gun lobby and vote with their constituents. Let me tell you what real accountability looks like, because the Speaker is absolutely right to frame this as a failure of Congress. Murphy says something does seem pretty wrong if democracy can't deliver on a 90% consensus, and not a consensus about whether your road gets paved, but a 90% consensus on whether kids live or die. This is the fundamental question of political legitimacy. When the government cannot or will not respond to supermajority preferences on existential questions, we need to ask whether the system is salvageable, or whether it requires more fundamental restructuring. The conservative movement has demonstrated that it will defend gun industry profits over children's lives, that it will obstruct popular legislation, defund research, dismantle enforcement mechanisms, and propagandize the public to protect a narrow special interest. This is not politics as usual. This is institutional sociopathy. The Speaker's refusal to accept the current state of affairs as inevitable is the only appropriate moral response, because the 336 school shootings recorded in 2024 are part of a larger crisis that has developed over the past few decades, marking the second highest number of school shootings on record. We're living through the worst period of school gun violence in American history, and one of our two major political parties refuses to acknowledge the crisis, much less address it. They've retreated into a hermetically sealed ideological bubble where any regulation of firearms is tyranny, and any dead child is the price of freedom. This is depraved, this is morally bankrupt, and everyone with a platform has an obligation to say so clearly and repeatedly until the political consequences become too great for Republicans to ignore. What the Speaker understands, and what every progressive must internalize, is that this is fundamentally a fight about power. The gun lobby has power because it has money to fund campaigns and mobilize single-issue voters. It uses that power to elect politicians who will do its bidding regardless of public opinion or public welfare. The only way to counter that power is through mass mobilization, through making gun violence such a salient issue that politicians face electoral consequences for obstruction, through primarying Republicans who vote with the gun lobby over their constituents, through sustained organizing and protest and civil disobedience if necessary. States have prioritized passing laws that fund community violence intervention, hold the gun industry accountable, and protect democratic institutions from gun violence, with more than a dozen states passing new gun safety laws in the first 6 months of 2025. Progress is possible when we organize and fight for it. The students who survive 2 school shootings before graduating college deserve so much better than what we're giving them. They deserve a political system that values their lives over gun industry profits. They deserve leaders who will act with the urgency this crisis demands. They deserve evidence-based policies implemented at scale. They deserve not to live in fear every time they enter a classroom. The Speaker is right to say this level of trauma is not acceptable. It's a moral abomination that future generations will look back on with the same horror we feel when studying historical atrocities. Except we don't have to wait for historical judgment. We can act now. We can pass universal background checks and assault weapons bans and ghost gun restrictions. We can fund violence prevention programs and mental health services. We can hold the gun industry accountable and vote out politicians who prioritize the Second Amendment over the right to life. The question is whether we have the political will to do it, or whether we'll continue to sacrifice children to the death cult of American gun culture. The Speaker is demanding we choose life, choose evidence, choose children over guns, and that's not just good policy. That's the minimum requirement of moral decency in a civilized society.